Hello, hello. Welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we're chatting with Claire Gorman, Sanjana Paul, and Cate Heine from MIT Senseable City Lab. MIT Senseable City Lab is a research initiative at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to anticipate changes in the way we describe, understand, and design cities. Claire Gorman is a creative technologist and researcher at the Senseable City Lab, where she works on technology-driven urban studies research. Her recent projects address topics including clean energy systems in cities, digital infrastructure for resource management, and the morphology of informal settlements. Sanjana Paul is a scientist and engineer working as a technical associate at MIT Senseable City Lab, where she explores urban environmental problems with the CityScanner Platform. Cate Heine is a PhD student in MIT's Institute for Data, Systems, and Society and a researcher at the Senseable City Lab, where she uses large geospatial datasets to study urban mobility patterns and social mixing in cities. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with these three ladies here, Sanjana Paul, Cate Heine, and Claire Gorman from MIT Senseable City Lab. Hi, everybody.
Hi, thank you for having us.
Hey, it's good to be here.
Thanks for being here. It's not often we interviewed three people, so this is going to be fun. Please tell us more about yourselves for our audience as well. And maybe Sanjana, you can start.
Yeah, sure. So hi, I'm Sanjana. I'm a technical associate at the Senseable City Lab, where I work mostly on the CityScanner project. CityScanner is an environmental sensor that harnesses fleets of vehicles that are in urban environments. So this could be anything from trash trucks to taxis for opportunistic environmental sensing. So we mostly focus on hyperlocal urban air quality, but we're also interested in parameters like heat and noise, and are kind of looking to expand the functionality of the system in the near future. So pass it to Cate.
Hi, I'm Cate. I'm a PhD student in the Institute for Data, Systems, and Society here, and a research assistant inside the Senseable City Lab. I would identify myself as a data scientist. So I work with the lab on analyzing large, mainly geospatial data sets to try and understand how people move around cities. Specifically, I've been focusing on projects in Stockholm and across the US that look at how people from different parts of a city or different socioeconomic backgrounds within a city mix with one another, or to what extent kind of their movements throughout a city are segregated from one another. Yeah.
And I'll conclude. Hi, my name is Claire. I'm a researcher at the Senseable City Lab, and I have worked on a variety of projects here, from urban morphology to new energy systems. But my background is in computer science and architecture, and my interests surround how digital technology and design can overlap to make our built and natural and social environments more sustainable and equitable.
Thank you. And these are going to be all very valid topics now throughout the course of this 1 hour, as we are very much aware that today's cities have a host of problems that we need to address and collaboratively through diverse disciplines. So it's great to see, these powerful brains coming together and really trying to address from through different approaches as well. So in that sense too, I would love to get your perspective on, I guess, some of the underlying reasons of the problems we see in the cities today, and why you think your solutions are, I guess, like driven in such direction in order to address those. We do often, I think there's a lot of surface problems that we observe. And I think, the tools you are creating is really trying to help us understand, having better idea of what we're observing and why, to be able to dig deeper. So I guess, what has driven you to create these solutions because of the problems you were observing? And as you're studying on these, what other insights have you been gathering as you're diving deeper into these problems? And whoever wants to go first.
I can start. Yeah, so like I said, my kind of domain of interest focuses on how people move and mix throughout a city, and to what extent people kind of travel the whole city and connect with one another, and to what extent they're sort of separate cities within cities, where different socioeconomic groups or neighborhoods are somewhat segregated and only interact with one another. And I think what's interesting to me about that question is that the reason that we have cities is there are a lot of really like rich resources that come from being located with other people, be that like tangible resources, like the fact that we can have like opera houses in big cities, and then also just the resource of like interactions with other people, which I think a lot of sociologists for decades and decades have pinpointed as a really big benefit of living kind of like in a society, in a city. But if people aren't mixing evenly and getting exposed to one another and able to explore a whole city, then those benefits aren't really evenly distributed across the residents of a city. So I think that's like kind of the motivating factor for me for studying social mixing in cities. Because we now have so much large data on how people move around cities, we can really identify that people are segregated in the way that they move through cities. This is something that's been mapped by a lot of different researchers. And actually, I think we at the Senseable City Lab think that the next step is like, okay, so what can we do about that? What are kind of spaces that can be created to help foster diverse interactions between people from far parts of the city? And how can we really pinpoint the effects of different types of spaces or different types of urban design on allowing people to mix? And it's a really difficult question, because the actual cause of this kind of like segregation or in the way that we move is really complex. It comes from personal preferences, it comes from transit systems, it comes from just the effects of residential segregation, which has its own driving forces and like housing prices and things like that. So it's a really big open question. And I'm not sure if that totally answered your question. That's me kind of like highlighting the issues and not necessarily the solutions. But yeah, we've been trying to look at specifically what are the spaces within cities where people really mix with one another in order to try and understand how to design cities that are kind of inclusive and equitable.
Yeah, amazing. I've so many thoughts on that, but I'll let all of you go first.
Yeah, I guess I can go next. I mean, touching upon a lot of what Cate said, there's this big question of kind of equity when it comes to the environment, because climate change and the drivers of climate change and the effects of climate change and environmental degradation are fundamentally unequal. Some groups are going to be more affected than others, and oftentimes there's a huge amount of overlap between the groups that are affected and the groups that really didn't contribute to the actions driving these forces. So, this effect definitely extends to cities as well, especially as the world is getting increasingly urbanized. So we have to think about concepts like environmental racism, and as Cate touched upon with segregation in housing, for example, how those factors in the built environment kind of translate into environmental phenomenon, like the urban heat island effect, where some people are exposed to much higher levels of heat than is kind of safe, how air pollution kind of clusters, and we have hot spots of air pollution in cities. So I think, the problems are many, unfortunately. We can really try and hold on to some optimism and say that also means we have a huge opportunity space in front of us. And it's really incredible to see how communities all over the world are stepping up and advocating for themselves, especially with the help of kind of low-cost environmental sensing. So I think that is really kind of a key technology that helps around environmental understanding and around transparency and kind of what's going on and what people are exposed to. But equally important is then actually, working together to address those problems. So I think what's really, really great about kind of having a multifaceted, approach to urban sensing is that you get to develop these low-cost sensor technologies, which can hopefully be distributed to people across the world to empower them to collect more data. But then also you kind of need to form those community partnerships and those partnerships with local governments to understand, okay, if we have all of this really, really helpful information, how are we actually going to make sure that we act on it? So I think that there's actually, the problem space is actually really coming from a social space, is thinking about what social forces cause these environmental problems. And the solution space, I think, is really equal parts of socially driven and kind of technologically driven in the service of all of these social factors. So it's a really fascinating, really much more complex space than you would originally think. Like atmospheric chemistry is already really complicated, right? But you can kind of like get a degree in civil engineering and kind of understand a little bit more about how those processes work. But having these lived experiences of these really complex social systems is actually, I think, a really overlooked part of the environmental movement. And so I really appreciate environmental justice, figures in the environmental justice movement kind of pushing those issues to the forefront. So it's a very transitional time right now.
Amazing. Claire?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Cate and Sanjana's work respectively addresses the social and environmental dimensions of cities and the problems that we have in those aspects. And both of those elements are also encoded in the physical city. For instance, the fact that many of our cities here in the US are built around cars, or they surround central business districts that are empty half the time but air conditioned all the time, or the capital projects we build that end up being huge devotion of resources to urban spaces that end up being civically and ecologically void, things like Hudson Yards, for instance. And I think there are elements of the social and environmental city that we can improve on a physical level. And some of the work that we've done in the lab addresses that. So the Favelas 4D project, for instance, used 3D laser scanning to analyze the morphology of a Brazilian favela, or an informal settlement, which has an extremely different architectural paradigm from the formalized cities that we're used to in the global north. The built environment is based around social and familial relationships. Families build their home with a flat roof, and then as their family expands, they build on top of it. So it's small units that are progressively added to over time, and that are connected by networks of semi-public, semi-private pedestrian arteries. And these environments are not very well mapped. There's only a small fraction of Rocinha, the favela we worked on, in Google Maps. And so we have very little information about them. So we went and collected this information and analyzed it. And part of the point of that was to identify ways in which the favela environment can be equitably and carefully improved. Things like looking at structural stability in these landslide prone areas that are very densely built, or things like airspace and sunlight access, given that they sometimes have environmental health problems. But at the same time, we can look at this alternate urban paradigm and learn something from another way of building cities. And of course, it's important not to fetishize these environments, which are ultimately the product of a lack of affordable housing and a very disenfranchised community. But there is also some really amazing value to be found in the ingenuity of building in this way. And I think we can look around and learn from things other than the built environment that we're surrounded by here in America, and find some really exciting alternative ways of building that will improve the social and environmental dimensions of our cities.
Amazing. All right, I'm gonna do like a synthesis of everything I've heard, and we'll like to get your thoughts on that. Like, number one, I think what I'm hearing a lot is that, I mean, we do live and operate in complex systems, right? Like and by definition, even if we can plan cities as if it was like a complicated system, or buildings that we're going to inhabit, once we introduce human behavior to it, it automatically becomes complex system. And then you're also talking about all these environmental factors that are already complex systems on their own. So we're dealing with highly complex problems, which therefore they call for emergent practices. But we cannot reach those emergent practices unless we have much better understanding of what we're interacting with too, which is like all the solutions that you're describing to me is like really bringing visibility, transparency, and data gathering really on these flows, interactions, and I guess environmental aspects of cities in general. So that's what I heard overall, which I think is hugely important to understand. You know, there is the infrastructure aspect to it, which you're also, you know, tracking information on, but the human element to it is very you know, complex, at times chaotic, depending on the times we live in, because it's a very volatile environment that we live in today. And with that, we are we kind of need to be more almost like responsive and adaptive to what we're observing, because we cannot necessarily always, I hear that we cannot necessarily always rely on kind of like prescriptive measures, because to your point, cities might be like having very, very different interactions just because of their environmental setting, context, and human culture there. And I like problems, I guess I heard is also though, like how these infrastructures could be the culprit for segregation, right? It's kind of like defining the flows of the human behavior through the transit system, through housing, through planning. And it's very interesting how that kind of evolves from there too. For example, I live in Brooklyn, New York, and right next to Fort Greene Park. And Fort Greene Park, on one side, it has social housing. On the other side has a very gentrified neighborhood. So to me, I would assume, the park is the area of congregating. This is where the two actually communities meet, and it's a more diverse group. But that doesn't happen. I never see people from social housing in the other side of the park, nor even in the center, but only at the edge that they border through their housing. And I see a very different population on a different side of the park. And it's so mind-blowing to me in terms of like, well, but when you just think about planning, this was supposed to work. But why isn't the human flow really representing that? And that's where we kind of start losing insight. And that's where I think what you guys are working on is really interesting, because that can bring in more insight into why is that happening, even though we planned for that not to happen. So that I find very fascinating. And then you mentioned about, the environment and housing and how is that impacting health. And we often say, housing is health in our studio too, just because of, like the differences we see in, I guess, healthcare implications of communities based on the environments they live in. And it's very interesting to be able to gather further data on that, to talk to local governments and CBOs, as you said, or really forcing bottom-up progress and push in order to influence top-down policies. As we all know, policy often lags, so waiting for a policy does not necessarily, or it's outdated, right? We plan and create zoning regulations and things, and they were created maybe in 1970s. We live in a total different world now. So in that sense, it could be an amazing way to really like influence policy and not wait for policy to come down to create more environmental justice or stop, creating inequitable spaces throughout cities. And then finally, what I heard and my synthesis was that in terms of the value in studying these overlooked or underserved environments, and it's very interesting. I'm part-time faculty at Parsons School of Design, and we were just in class yesterday talking about Alejandro Aravena's favela project, where he did like half of a good home. I don't know if you know that project, but so bringing the flexibility for the families there to continue to build upon it, which inherently I think is genius, just because it really understands the community and it's very human-centric in that sense, like really understanding the human behaviors and therefore leaving them a space, but more secure and a controlled space for them to continue to create. So providing that flexibility for placemaking to happen. And I think, we live in such a volatile world, and I think the term now is VUCA, right? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. We live in a VUCA world that I definitely agree that we somehow need to bring in that flexibility, adaptability more to our infrastructure, just because like having such rigid settings do not work anymore. And it's much more costly maybe in some settings to be able to do that. But I guess the question is, how do we learn from maybe favelas in that sense that we could bring that flexibility and adaptability into urban settings in United States as well. So hopefully I understood everything correct. Was that a proper, I guess, framing and synthesis of what you just shared?
Yeah, I think that was a perfect synthesis. Great.
All right.
Yeah.
Perfect. Great. So I guess my follow-up question then on these is that what are some of the challenges have you been seeing in, because what you're doing is first of all, you're identifying an emergent practice to even research further on these, right? Like, we're going to try this because we want to get more information on XYZ. And then there's the communication of that data and potential, I guess, design proposals of what might happen based on the insights. So throughout this process, like research, I guess, synthesis and like design ideation, what are some of the challenges or roadblocks that you see, or you get feedback that, you know, this won't work because, or we cannot use that as data here because, or this is not our responsibility, so we cannot act on that? Like any type of like pushback or I guess criticism or roadblock that you faced while you're like, I guess, kicking these off and implementing?
I have a technical one. So one of the dimensions that we work with and around at the Senseable City Lab is privacy and the different expectations of how and where and what kind of data we can collect. And I would hesitate to call that a roadblock, because I wouldn't want to insinuate that we are trying to get around anybody's idea of privacy. And so it's not so much a problem that we face as an informant of our research and the kind of research that we do. So for instance, in the Favelas project, doing things like measuring the height of buildings or the width of streets is actually much easier to do with images than it is to do with 3D laser scanning point cloud information. That the data that we have collected is very heavy, it's extremely dense, and it's very challenging to work with because there are not, for instance, the machine learning tools available yet to infer from a LiDAR point cloud what is a wall and what is a window and what is a door, whereas you can very easily identify those things in images and get much more information that, for instance, counts things like units or measures regions in images, etc., from two-dimensional image information. However, in a favela environment, the community is very uncomfortable with cameras. The residents are not open to outside people coming in with iPhones or with other kinds of cameras and walking around taking photos or video of their environment. However, the LiDAR scanner, because it's a surveying tool and because it's not capturing anything that's identifiable to a person, is much more amenable to their privacy needs. And so we have had to be very creative about our research methods in order to accommodate that. And I think that's kind of an example of how you have to work around the existing city and the existing expectations in order to get to something better. And so it's on us as the researchers to find creative ways to get the information that we're looking for and answer the questions that we're interested in ways that are minimally disruptive to the communities that we work with.
I love that. Anything else?
Yeah, I think an additional, I think Claire's exactly right, that I think privacy comes into play in all the projects that we work on, just because data gathering is such a big part of what we do. I think kind of a separate issue that you've touched on a bit, the really cool thing, I mean, what we do at the Sensible City Lab is a lot of sensing, so a lot of like gathering of data. And what's cool about that is that we can take kind of ideas and theories about urban design, like, as you said, putting a park in between two different communities will help to bring them together, which are based on kind of like local knowledge and observation. And we can kind of upscale the observation in a big way. So we can say, okay, well, if you take kind of pings from cell phone users across the world, are they actually gathering in parks or not? And by doing that upscaling, we can like really pick up on nuances that wouldn't necessarily be feasible with like manual observation of individuals. Like for instance, people aren't actually mixing on a finer geospatial scale if you're inside of a park. But at the same time, with that upscaling of observation, I think we can run into risks of painting too broad of strokes and missing out on local knowledge, which is also really important. So one, I think, example of that is I work on a project with the city of Stockholm and researchers at Cate in Stockholm. So I'm kind of from my little computer in Cambridge, crunching a bunch of numbers about the way that people move around Stockholm with only having been to Stockholm once for several days and not speaking Swedish, not knowing, like not being fully ingrained in Swedish culture, etc. So every month, the fact that it's a partnership with the city of Stockholm and with urban planners who do more qualitative work inside of KTH has been super, super valuable, because every month we have a meeting where I say, this is what I'm seeing in the data, and they say, this is why that doesn't make sense, or this is why no one's going to kind of respond to that information in a valuable way as people who like live in the city and actually know what goes on there. So navigating, like communicating information to people who are, I think it's two different things. One, communicating information to people who are kind of like coming from different backgrounds, be that the people who we're working with inside the city of Stockholm, the researchers at KTH, and the kind of Swedish public, which we've had done a lot of webinars, just communicating results to the people in Stockholm about kind of like what the research that they are paying for is showing, has been super interesting just in terms of thinking about how to communicate knowledge in a way that's really valuable, but then also like receiving local knowledge from all of those stakeholders has been really important in terms of designing research and making sure that we're not, getting lost in the numbers and not actually taking like valuable context into account. So yeah, I think just making sure that we can both receive and communicate more local knowledge outside of the more detached academic context, I think, is an issue that we run into in all of our projects as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I mean, I think the points that you both brought up around, privacy, context, and communication are central themes in any urban data gathering sort of experiment. Is making sure that you can respect people's right to privacy, is making sure that, this isn't like a strangely detached environmental sensing project where even though it's embedded in the environment, it's not interacting with anyone in the environment. So thinking about those things, and I guess more broadly, then also thinking about just research practices, right? Which, Kate, I think you used a great term saying like the kind of detached academic world, because like sometimes it's really tempting to just be like, wow, this is such a cool, interesting problem. What a cool, interesting environment. But especially when it comes to like, the environment, the built environment, the air that we breathe, it's not theoretical, right? It's very real, and it affects all of us very, very much. So thinking, I think, carefully and thinking critically about research practices and who they've served in the past, who they've helped and who they've harmed, and thinking critically about that in the context of local knowledge, of environmental knowledge, of the environmental situation we're in, of the phrase you said earlier, VUCA, like a volatile, like the really volatile world that we're in. How can we contextualize these academic practices so that they actually help people in these spaces, right, and connect with communities? And then secondly, I think also talking about kind of our really great partnership with KTH Royal Institute of Technology is figuring out how to bridge like the hope gap, right? A sentence that you see a lot of times in environmental papers is that like, we hope that this will help policymakers make decisions, but that's not necessarily a strategy. So something that's really, really, I think, useful about the work that we do and that's really valuable is being able to connect with people who are in city and local government and kind of speak with them further to understand, like, is this actually helpful in the way that we thought it was, kind of going back to contextualizing how we do research and why we do research. So trying to figure out how to then apply that knowledge in other cities across the world while also maintaining the utmost respect for local culture and local practices is, I think, a big challenge that extends far beyond the reaches of our lab, but is something I think we definitely engage with a lot at our lab, since we have the privilege of working with partners from all over the world. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's so in terms of, the challenges you face, I hear, I guess like communication and bridging the quantitative and qualitative, as well as really like defining the right research methods. But it also sounds like it's something that you can address through really co-creation in order to, you know, identify research methods that would work for a community, or really work with like partners that are local, whether those are like local authorities or CBOs, to make sure you are working on something more authentic and it's not really like top down. So in that sense, I feel like, not to your point, Claire, like really overcoming roadblocks, but is really creating a better framework that would work for everybody. And what you said also, Sanjana, in terms of, you know, helping build almost a strategic roadmap to ensure to bridge kind of the like academia and practice, right? Because there's like wonderful research that we also often like look into in academia, but also like we always face, okay, but then unless if there's like policy around it, how might we implement this? And we could run into like kind of like large gaps there, but providing something feasible or identifying urban interventions that might help in implementation, I think those are invaluable to really be able to bring that valuable data and research into practice, and really empower and encourage urban planners too, because I could see everything that you're doing could be a potential like toolkit really for urban planner to really better or more, I guess, like I don't want to say better, but create something that is more flexible or adaptive, or addressing local needs as well, and not necessarily bringing like an overarching view of, you know, this is the right way to plan cities, so this is what we're going to do here. So I guess with all of that, one question I would have to you all is, and you did mention like working with locals, which is like very important, but also, how do you see such tools and mechanisms scale, understanding different mindsets as well and cultures? So quick example, I'm not going to give any names. We're called What's Wrong With, but we don't want to trash talk about people. But we were meeting with Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, and they were talking about all like the transitions that they're doing in the Schiphol Airport, like going into a really like circular model, even, you know, leasing out the light bulbs so that they make sure it goes back to the manufacturer and they're not throwing it trash when it's completes this lifetime, whatever, all of that. And then we were discussing, how do we consider also human behavior in ensuring Schiphol actually becomes very sustainable? Because, you know, if the people visiting the airport is not, let's say, recycling properly, or not utilizing retail shops that actually provide sustainable materials or products or food, whatever that is, it does not necessarily help them get to all the goals that they have, right? So they could create kind of like the infrastructure that is sustainable, but how might they actually create interventions within the airport to help sustainability come as a convenience to all the visitors as well? So that was like something we were exploring. And I was talking about this to a developer in United States. And then, you know, like factoring in human behavior and identifying interventions that would really enable sustainability to become a convenience and a common practice for the users and visitors. And that person told me, well, yeah, that would never work in a capitalist country. So this could not work in US. So like, by the way, like these, like they have no budget problems. They're one of the largest, right? So it's not about budget even, but it's just the mindset and this like prejudice on why like we can or cannot do that. So I guess like I'm curious, in, you know, once you become data driven, is that how we kind of like overcome these? Like, how do we shift paradigms and mindsets through bringing more visibility and bringing more data? And how do you see we navigate around this so what you're doing could also scale to better inform and help people actually adopt better practices?
I mean, I feel like that's the ultimate question, right? Like when it
So I
comes
just
to
dumped the biggest question on you.
but having it be the biggest question also means that there's not just one answer, right? Is that, you know, when we think about any of the largest problems that we're facing, climate change, biodiversity loss, a global pandemic, these are all really big questions that need a combination of top-down policies, bottom-up approaches, and also like, you know, whatever stuff can be sort of driven from the middle ground. So, I mean, I think that there's the only way I can think of to approach that question is to start by approaching one facet of that question at a time, right? And is to, you know, remember sort of to contextualize things that like, yes, you're in this larger sort of global system, especially in the industrialized global north, but also, you know, you have a certain sphere of influence and kind of how can you drive tangible action in that sphere of influence? And then once you've made a certain amount of progress, how can you start to kind of reach beyond that sphere of influence? So that's one aspect of it. And then the other aspect of it, it's kind of like the individual versus collective action when it comes to climate policy, right? You can tell people to recycle and compost all you want, but if the infrastructure to compost doesn't exist, how are they going to actually do that, right? So I think it's just kind of thinking about specific instances of those things and kind of saying, okay, like what can I do right now? Who can I speak with? What amount of, again, privilege do I have to sort of like influence this certain amount of space? Who can I advocate for? And kind of start from there, just because I really feel it feels so overwhelming sometimes that otherwise you don't know what to do. And I've definitely had those moments, you know, working, both looking at global air quality and also in previous roles, kind of looking at global air quality patterns, just like paralyzed, like this is so bad. This is so bad. We literally have entirely new weather systems and storms springing from wildfires, which are reaching, you know, smoke plumes lofting to heights that we never should have seen in natural systems before, stuff like that. So it can get really bad really quickly. So I think just kind of, again, scaling down, understanding it's multifaceted and that like these things, you know, these decisions that kind of put these maybe not so great systems in place were made by people. And so good decisions can also be made by people. This isn't something that we just have to live with. We can work together and we can sort of build a future that is much more equitable and much more safe and much more just. So I don't even know if that was an answer, but that's kind of approaches my thinking.
That was a perfect answer. You basically just told me systems views sometimes could be paralyzing. So we really need to kind of identify elements of that we could start addressing, and really going back to what you first said around like building in a strategy and the strategic roadmap to like how, like who do we even start talking to about this, right? Like in the end, the more successful case studies and examples we could create, the more it's going to have influence in the industry anyway. So we just need to find maybe, let's say, the early adopters or people who really like understand or value the data, value the research, and want to try something different. And after that, like really creating those examples to not only influence like other players in the system, but also policy potentially to expedite this. Because as you said, nothing is going to work without public-private partnership and collaboration. And we really need to, and policy does expedite things for sure. We see this more even on like sustainability efforts today. Like 10 years ago, if we talked to developers about sustainability, the reaction they would give was so much more different than what it is today, now having all the local regulations or federal regulations as well. And, you know, for example, a shift we're seeing more in maybe consumer goods and other industries is more towards like inclusion and human centricity. So thinking more about equity, which we don't necessarily see that yet a lot in real estate, maybe a little bit more in urban planning. But we also know, you know, a few years from now, that's going to be a larger conversation. It's just a lagging conversation. So how do we help expedite this through the right strategy and really defining kind of milestones for ourselves, like get there too? Because I do agree, like, and when we throw in like terms that are so big as well, like climate change, what does that even mean? Like, how do you break that down? Like, what is that? Like, how does an individual start action towards that too? It's very difficult. But we do need to be able to break down the problem, just because, you know, awareness is a starting point. But if we do want to take action, we need to realize that we could only do like so much at one at a time. But really having kind of an objective of where we're going, I think that's what we all could, aim for. So in that sense, I definitely resonate with what you're saying. And also it really helps me to also like calm down at times when I'm, like also very frustrated and like, we need a global collaboration like today. Why is this not happening? Moments. But yes, totally hear you. So I guess also I would love to ask, you gave examples of some of the projects you're working on, kind of what's next for Senseable City Lab, what other type of projects you would like to work on, or would you like to see more at the lab, or any new exciting things that are happening? If it's not confidential, obviously.
This is a hard question to answer for one person because the lab goes in a lot of different directions at the same time.
Yeah.
We have teams working on visual AI, we have engineers building autonomous boats and CityScanner devices, we have data scientists like Cate, we have designers working on things. So it's hard to say that there's one specific direction that we're moving in. However, I would say that one of the exciting things that's happening more and more at the lab as we do more and more research is that we are approaching the same topics and themes from many different angles, and we can synthesize insights from that. So for instance, one of the lab's earlier projects a few years ago is called Treepedia, and it uses Google Street View imagery and visual AI approaches to identify essentially a green index in the city by figuring out which pixels are green. And that project kind of hinges on this assumption that green is good. We want our cities to be as green as they can be. And in many ways, that kind of basic assumption makes sense. But then in Cate's work, for instance, we see that actually maybe parks are not as successful as social mixing places as we might think. So there is more to green space than initially meets the eye. And green space needs other things about it in terms of the design, the quantity, the location, in order to be successful as a social mixing place. And then in Sanjana's work also, we find that in a recent CityScanner deployment in the Bronx in particular, air quality particulate concentrations actually spike near parks because their parks tend to be located near highways, and because there are also aspects of the metabolism of trees that impact the air quality in certain ways as well. She can elaborate on that in case I'm saying it wrong. But essentially, my point is that we do research that touches on different themes in cities, but also we approach the same themes from different directions. And I think there are interesting insights that can be synthesized from using different kinds of information and different approaches to look at these factors in cities, and therefore gain a more holistic idea of what we need to prioritize.
I love that. I also know it was a tough question for like tree researchers who are like working on it. What's the dream project? But anything, Sanjana, Kate, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure this is actually an answer to the question that you asked, but kind of spiraling off of what Claire said about collaboration between different perspectives. I think something that's been really exciting about the lab recently. I've been working here, like by far the majority of my time has been COVID era, when I've been sort of like alone on my computer in my apartment. Or my parents' living room at times. And so being back in person has been really exciting for the reasons that Claire said. There are like a lot of people from a lot of different perspectives in one place who are interested in the same issues. So I've been working on a few projects with a little team of us who are like someone who is an economist, a PhD student in the urban studies program here, someone who is a transportation planner, and then myself, like a little number cruncher. And the fact that we've had a team of people who are coming from different like academic backgrounds and are really interested in the same things, but have different skill sets and backgrounds of literature living in our heads and approaches living in our heads, and can tackle the same problem has been really a fun and exciting part about being in the same place as other people, and I think has kind of produced the types of research that Claire was talking about, where we can kind of realize that we're looking at the same issues from different perspectives and see what we have to learn from one another, which I think has been just exciting and hopeful. And there's actually a project in the lab on what being in the same space does for collaboration using email. So
I love that.
that's a cool paper if you want to check it out.
I would love to check it out. Sanjana, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I just really want to build off of, I think collaboration is really key. I think that what I really appreciate about the lab is the very interdisciplinary or sometimes even anti-disciplinary approach to problems. Because one thing that used to really bother me, I'm an electrical engineer by training. So I studied electrical engineering and physics. And now I have to draw a diagram to explain to people that I'm an electrical engineer, but I work in air quality in the urban planning department. And like people still don't really get it. So I really appreciate that, just, the focus questions and problems and objectives, as opposed to, no, you studied this, so you have to do that. So I am excited for the lab to continue to just collaborate across disciplines to kind of approach problems and projects in the way that I think the 21st century really demands. And honestly, how problems have always demanded. It's just been a disservice to kind of research that it wasn't conducted that way before.
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, my background is in industrial engineering and finance, and now I practice in design strategy. So we at Sauer, we very much value diverse lived and professional experiences. So I think it definitely is the way to address even the problems we're facing today, because there's such complex problems that there's no way one discipline or experience could address. So it's crucial, especially in the field that you're studying. Last but not least, I would love to hear any tips or quick advice to anybody who wants to make progress in this world.
I feel like what I'm going to say is you should listen to what Sanjana said like 5 minutes ago, because I felt inspired by it, just in terms of, I think there are a lot of problems in the world and it can be really overwhelming trying to figure out where your place is in studying them and thinking about them. And no one can solve any large problem on their own, but we can all kind of do little tiny pieces of the puzzle. And so I think just finding something that you think is interesting and fun to study, and also that you think kind of works towards a mission that you're excited about, however small that is kind of all that anyone can do. And I think what she said was really useful and important about not kind of getting paralyzed by the big picture and the giant problems, and just kind of focusing on something that you're excited about and you think is good.
I love that.
Absolutely. I think to add to that, on this topic of collaboration, all three of us are interdisciplinary people working in an interdisciplinary environment. But one of the things that I personally have learned since joining the lab is that emphatically there's no point in being interdisciplinary on your own. The point of interdisciplinarity is to be able to communicate with other people across the disciplines that you know and don't know. So I would say it's amazing to study architecture and computer science and data science and transportation and electrical engineering and environmentalism and all of these things. But the objective of that is to be able to communicate with other people who are on either side and within all of those fields. And so I think to that end, I would emphasize the importance of communication and the importance of articulating the data that we have, the findings that we have, and what we're offering from a research standpoint to everyone in terms of making collaboration possible. So interdisciplinary thinking, and also clear communication of our research, our priorities of the labs, and I think our values that can be carried forth in other interdisciplinary projects as well.
Right. So interdisciplinary evolving into, I guess, transdisciplinary, so that it transcends beyond your disciplines. I guess that is that they're probably there are a lot of disciplinary, I guess, words, but I guess that's what we mean here. Got it. Yeah. All right. Thank you. Sanjana?
Yeah. I mean, I guess two things. One is really, really deeply learn from people who have come before you. both in terms of, that's a great starting point if you're not sure where to start. And then also there's no need to reinvent the wheel every single time. And it allows for much deeper impact. Again, if you engage with local communities who already have local knowledge, if you explore methods that have been put forward by people, stuff like that. So do a landscape analysis of kind of your interests and kind of how you want to approach doing things. And then the second thing, I guess, is don't let your imagination be limited. Because again, the bounds of like disciplinarity and, oh, this is all that's possible, the economy, we're not going to be able to address climate problems. We're not going to be able to make a just world for people. Don't let your imagination be limited by that, because it's very constraining and it kind of doesn't allow you to think about what all is really possible. Because again, these systems were created by people and people can change them. So I think, one thing I really wish that I had thought of when I was, or someone had told me when I was younger, is that you don't have to be constrained to kind of the same bounds as everyone who's kind of come before you, or kind of even is with you right now. You can think a little bit beyond that if you want, and kind of aim for that, even if it seems totally impossible, because that's how the status quo has shifted in the past, right? Is thinking about, oh my gosh, it would be so crazy if we had a solar panel, right? And now we have a bunch of solar panels. So yeah, I think learn from those who came before you, and don't let your imagination be limited.
I love these so much. I wish I heard all of these when I was also younger, but better late than never. So, and thank you for providing that to our audience. And thank you so much for your time today. This was such a treat. I feel like I could talk to you three all day with so many questions and I guess curiosity and venting, probably all of the above that we face in our also day to day. But your work is incredibly meaningful, and I hope it transcends into very diverse disciplines and countries and cities, so that we just create better environments for ourselves in the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great to talk to you.
Yes, it was a pleasure. Thanks for having us.
And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.